Hello?
Oh, hello.
Oh,
Welcome.
hello. We got it.
Good, finally. So it's working as it should be. Okay, so we can start. So, hello, everyone. Good morning. It's quite an unusual time on our side of the world, quite early for a conference. And so I hope you will enjoy it. And welcome again, Avellinou. So, today we are going to interview our guest, Avellinou Balestri. Avellinou is a very active person. She is the editor or chief editor of an online magazine, Fellowship and Fairy Dust. Besides that, she publishes also articles in many other magazines, mostly with fiction and nonfiction, I believe. And the nonfiction is mostly focused on religious analysis or something related to religion. And besides that, she also organized a conference last year, which was dedicated to the memory of Tolkien. And she has some interesting plans for the future as well. So welcome again.
Thank you so much, Martina. I'm really glad to be here.
We too. Okay, so I don't know where to start. So maybe let's start from the beginning. How did you get into writing and into becoming the chief editor of an online magazine?
Well, when it comes to writing, I've sort of been doing that for almost as long as I can remember in some form or other, pretty much when I got my first journal when I was around 9. And I just started journaling things that would happen to me or stories that came into my head. I've always had an interest in the legends of Robin Hood since I was really quite young. So some of my earliest stories were Robin Hood related that I would jot down in my journals. And it just kind of progressed from there. I always wanted to be a writer. And so I became involved in trying to submit my stories and poems to different online and then eventually print magazines and publications. And this sort of led to how I got involved in an editorial position because I was writing for an online website called the Homeschool Literary Quarterly. And this was when I was about 15 or so, 15, 16. And then I had met some fellow writers on there, and the entire site wound up closing down. And we were kind of left in a bit of a lurch, not quite sure, where to go with our work now, because we had kind of formed this little literary sorority of sorts. And so we decided, well, we'll just pick up and continue, do our own thing. So we started what was then called Expressions in 2012. And at the time, there was only 3 of us, and I was basically the assistant editor. So we ran with this. Eventually, the name changed to be the Fellowship of the King, which was kind of a Tolkien reference because it had grown at this point, and some of the things that were drawing us together were interest in basically a lot of Christian literary figures who did deal in fantasy and other things as well. But Tolkien was definitely an inspiration behind that. So you have Tolkien, Lewis, Chesterton, George MacDonald, that whole general type of writing did inspire us. And so that was how the Fellowship of the King got off the ground. And it just kind of organically grew and expanded. And so then eventually the editor wound up stepping back, and I wound up becoming the editor-in-chief, and this was in 2015. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I got the position with the Fellowship of the King. And then in 2017, Ink and Fairy Dust, which was something of a pioneer online magazine with a similar general feel, kind of basically for Christian youth and interested in sort of fantasy and storytelling. And they wound up losing their editor and being on the brink of shutting down, and they didn't have anyone to replace. So I basically said, hey, how about I take it and then we'll mesh the two. And that's what happened. And so in 2017, it became Fellowship and Fairy Dust, and the two became became one, basically. And it's been that way ever since.
Yeah. I didn't realize it's already 4 years. I joined you when you were still the previous one, the Fellowship of the King.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like it just happened, but time moves so fast, and I feel like this year alone just feels like a century in some ways, and then also it feels like a day because not much happened, like normal scheduling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so as you said, you write both fiction and nonfiction, and which do you like better and why?
That's an interesting question. I think I like them both in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So with nonfiction, it's in some ways it's easier, I would say, because it is just your voice. When you're doing like a review of a film or some kind of a spiritual reflection or even a current events analysis, you aren't having to think in other people's voices. Whereas when you're doing fiction, you do. But in a way, I like the fact that it is an exercise, in a sense, an exercise in empathy in some ways, that you have to try when you're writing fiction to put yourself into another person's mind and heart and voice. So I think that I like them both in different ways for different reasons. I would say that doing both, I think, it informs how, like, doing the one informs how the style of the other comes out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my nonfiction style does come through in the fact that I do have quite a bit of narration. And some people will say I'm a bit narration heavy in my fiction. And part of that probably is because I do write a lot of nonfiction as well. So there is probably an influence of the two going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. And which genre do you read more?
I'm sorry?
Which genre do you read more, like in number of quantity of the articles or the pieces written?
Probably, okay, so at the moment, that would be fiction, but that's only because I'm super focused on trying to complete my novel, which I'm very near to. I should actually be done with the first complete draft of it by the end of the year, and I'm hoping to have it published on Amazon and other places early next year. So that's why the fiction at the moment. But in general, like the wide sweep of what I've done so far, it would be nonfiction as far as the articles that have been turned out and such, online and in print publications.
Okay, so mentioning your book, can you introduce it a little bit? Like, what will it be about?
Sure. So it is, some things never change. It is a Robin Hood retelling. And basically, I wanted to write something like this for a very long time. I think it just sort of felt like the right time to try for it. And so it's kind of aimed at being, in some ways, a more realistic retelling, like a little bit more plausible, but it also is trying to keep some faith with the legendary material and the historical material and trying to kind of find, I guess, a balance between the two. And it does start, this particular novel is the first one in an 8-book series. So this particular one does focus on basically Robin's origin story. So it starts when he's a very young child, and it also basically focuses from the perspectives of 3 of the main characters. This book and the following book, so the first 2 books in the series, focus on the perspectives of Robin, of Marion, and of Roger Cavendish, who is going to be the future Sheriff of Nottingham. But we don't know that yet. But so that is, and they're all portrayed as being neighbors in basically the outskirts of Nottingham, of like the wider shire of Nottingham. They all come from landowning families that are right next to each other. And so there, in some ways, some people have said it feels a little bit it's a little bit like a social drama in some ways as a result of this, because we are focusing on the three families quite a bit and the way that they engage in the sort of microcosm of society. And in other ways, I've had another friend say it kind of feels like a little bit of an autobiography of Robin Hood or something to that effect, which I think is fair in some ways. I think it's a little more than that, obviously, because it switches off to other characters. But still, there is a sense of it being less action-adventure. I think that's maybe the thing that really defines it, because a lot of Robin Hood stories, they tend, and movies especially, tend to be a lot of action-adventure and minimal, I guess, sort of more, again, just social drama, personal drama, religious drama as well was kind of in that mix. So it's a bit more of that. It's a bit more slow-paced in that sense, and it's a bit more interior. It's much more about character development than it is exterior action, if that makes sense.
I must admit that I've actually never seen or read the Robin Hood stories. I have the rough idea. What the legend was about. But this, what you said, sounds very interesting, and I think I'm gonna buy your book when it comes out.
Well, that would be wonderful. I'll definitely let you know when it's out. But yeah, I mean, just for the audience who may not know, basically Robin Hood is a famous legendary English outlaw who basically was a hero of the people. And there's no way of pinning down if there's any one man who was Robin Hood, but I think he is many figures, frankly, over the course of basically a wide swath of time, stretching all the way from the Norman conquest up to, honestly, up to almost beyond tracing, in a sense. I think there's so many characters that have gone into that story, and I think the reason why he's so relatable to so many people is because he is a kind of rogue hero, anti-hero in some ways, that he's not your stereotype of a hero. He's kind of subversive, and he's unexpected. You don't expect, an outlaw or robber on the highway necessarily to be a do-gooder, but that sort of is the complex charm of Robin, that he's both a thief, but he's a thief with a conscience, and he's a thief who basically has a soft spot for the downtrodden, and is mostly basically doing what he does to those in positions of power and basically who have abused their power, and taken advantage of the weak and helpless. So that is one of the reasons why he has been such a compelling character, and so many retellings have been done.
I believe he's quite a familiar character also in the context of European history. And the fun fact is that we have a similar figure in Slovakia, and he was a real person. So there are evidences that he existed, that he lived, and that he was punished for his crimes. And he did something similar, that he was taking the money from the rich people and trying to distribute it to the poor people. So he was also some kind of a thief with consciousness. So.
Oh, wow, that's really fascinating. Because, and this is something I've run into too with the research, that I think almost like every major culture has some figure like this, kind of the archetype of the outlaw who is still the champion of the people. Because I've run into it in, they have it in Wales, in Scotland, in Arabia, in Ethiopia, all over the place. They'll have this archetype, and as you say, in Slovakia. So that's just really, really fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So what does the process of writing look like for you? Do you have like any routine or schedule?
Not a particular schedule. I mean, it kind of depends. I am a bit of a night owl, so I do tend to project through the night. And we'll go on kind of night-long binges when I have something in my head I try to project down. As far as the process of writing, I mean, I would say it's different with fiction to nonfiction. The nonfiction articles, as I say, are much easier for me to write. I can turn them out quickly. It's the same with poetry, because I also write poetry. I tend to be able to turn that out quickly, unless it's a really long poem. Sometimes I'll take a shot at doing something epic, but if not, it's pretty straightforward. I can get it out pretty easily. And usually I can do it in kind of a single swipe. I'll go over it the next day, maybe with a once over. But with fiction, it's harder. It does require more, times going over it. So what I'll usually do is I'll try to jot down, my main bulk, sort of flood of consciousness, in a sense, dialogue and whatnot. And I get inspired a lot by conversations I'll have with people. So I may have a conversation with someone on Facebook, for example, and I'll be like, oh, you know what? That is a good idea for a conversation I can have these two characters have. And so I'll write that down. And then, of course, I'll run it by friends. And then they'll say, oh, this seems too dragged on, or oh, this doesn't seem, time period appropriate. And then I'll edit it and re-edit it and re-edit it. So there is that sort of cycle, which is much more meticulous when I'm trying to do the fiction. And I think, again, it just comes down to doing the different voices. So there's always this double thought, like, does this sound like a different person, or does it just sound like me talking again and again, like talking to myself? So that generally, and I mean, I guess as far as process, I do tend to write out of order. So if it's like, again, with fiction, I'll write out of order. And so my tendency, and I do this a bit with reading, which, and some people think is really weird, but sometimes I'll read out of order as well. I'll read a book out of order, and then I'll wind up reading it through in chronological order at the end, afterwards. But my instinct will be to sort of view a story as almost building blocks. And you're trying to see how the building blocks fit together. So with writing, I definitely do go for trying to, oftentimes I'll wind up writing the end first, or a major scene first, like a major dramatic sequence I'll wind up writing first. For me, a lot of the times this manifests itself in like major characters or secondary characters even. I know I'm going to wind up killing off, and it's like really important to the story, their death scene. I'll wind up doing that first and then coming back around. And usually what winds up happening is that you finish the beginning and you finish the middle. Sorry, you finish the beginning, you finish the end, and you have to fill in the middle. Mm-hmm. And try to make sure that when you're filling in the middle, it's all consistent with each other by the end. So that means reading through it again and making sure, oh, does this chapter feel like it is going into the next chapter properly? Does it feel like it's flowing properly? Or does it just feel like a patchwork quilt that is too obviously separate from each other, as opposed to a batter where everything is stirred in and properly configured?
So for how long have you been working on this novel?
I would say probably for about, well, you see, hard to say, because what I started to do was write the whole series almost, because in the very beginning, I didn't know it was going to be a whole series. And I thought it was just going to be one book. And then as it started to manifest itself, this was about 4 years ago, I basically started to realize, no, this is not going to be a single book. This thing is going to be a long, possibly number of books. And the pieces that make up this book now used to be flashbacks. Mm-hmm. So they used to be within later books, now later books. I feel like this is almost getting like Star Wars. It's like episode 1, 2, and 3 that actually used to be episode, and basically I moved them back. I said, you know what, it's too many flashbacks. It's getting distracting. And some other friends had said that to me, and I said, you know what, you're kind of right. So I just took them all out, and I said, all right, I'm just going to make this a standalone. I'll just make this a prequel in a sense. So it turned into basically 2 prequels that are basically set up books for the rest of the series. But overall, so the whole arch of the project I've been working on for about 4 years.
Mm-hmm. And what do you enjoy the most about your writing process?
Well, probably when I do get the feeling like I've conveyed like if I read something back and I'm like, oh well, that actually that felt resonant. That felt, that felt like I was actually conveying a real emotion, or those characters felt real to me. And of course, I feel good when friends will say that as well, like, oh, that scene actually, that scene achieved something. And so that definitely, I guess for me, I am kind of an emotional writer.
Mhm.
So I do want the readers to feel emotionally engaged in the
Yeah.
story of these characters. And so it does make me feel, I guess, the happiest in the process when I feel like I've succeeded in doing that, and other people are able to experience that as well.
Mhm. And what do you struggle the most?
Well, again, probably, okay. So again, part of it is always trying to make sure that what you're writing doesn't just sound like you talking, that it does sound individual. Probably one of the things that I'm particularly picky about is a thing called tonal whiplash, which I'm very cautious about doing, because it's easily one of the most common things I see ruin book series and ruin TV shows or movies or anything like that. There's a tendency to have a certain, like, the reader or the viewer will have a certain expectation when they're going into something. And there's a way in which to kind of gently guide them into mood changes or mood, basically mood nuances, like for different parts of the story. But if it's done too abruptly, it can distort, in a sense, the story you're trying to tell, and it can turn people right off. And just, it can be throwing. I personally think Harry Potter suffered from this a bit, in which you had a series that made you feel in the beginning that it was sort of more safe. I don't know quite how to describe that, but it was a sense of safety to it. And then, even though there was stakes, but it just felt a different mood and tone. And then it changed rather radically. And I honestly felt like the author didn't need to do that. There was a way to preserve the mood and heighten the stakes more gradually. So that's something I worry about in my writing. I guess that it is like a difficult thing to sometimes even know, because when you're in it, you're like, oh, I'm just telling the story. And then suddenly someone will say, whoa, that was just out in left field. What happened? And you're like, oh, all right. Um, I guess what it is anticipating. I guess anticipating trigger warnings is been one of the difficulties I've had, because people will have different sensitivity levels. And so I think one of the struggles of writing a Robin Hood book is that there is this thing that's happened within the sort of fandom culture of, because there's actually quite a few people who write Robin Hood retellings and who get really invested into the whole art of it. Like, they research all the legends and they really get into it. And they kind of fall into two camps, and typically the retellings, even on screen, have done this. And the one camp is more, I guess, lighthearted, fairy tale oriented, family friendly, I guess would be one way of putting it. And the other tends to go for kind of a raw historical, sometimes actually goes right into sort of grimdark, gothic. And there tends to be this two-way split. And so when picking up a Robin Hood novel, there's this tendency to anticipate which side is it going to be on. And for me, I'm not really doing either. I haven't really fallen in either camp, because for me, the story is supposed to be grounded in the sometimes brutal historical realities of this era. It does contain dark themes. It contains issues that range from basically sexual assault to suicide to just the kind of torture, so it does contain these themes, but at the same time, it also, I don't want to use these things as shock factor or just stuffing them in for, oh, I'm just here to be edgy. It's not that way. And there's a lot of stuff in it which involves hope and redemption and comfort and kind of, I guess, the stuff that you would imagine in the warm and fuzzy camp, but is in this. So I kind of balance the two. And I guess for me, the difficult line is how to integrate the two to make it feel like real life. Because in a sense, when you get down to it, that is real life. We have all of these terrible things in the world, but at the same time, we have so much that is good and beautiful in the world and meaningful. And so in a sense, I think I'm trying to bring together both realities and say, well, yeah, this is true. I'm not going to shy away from the brutal realities, but I'm also not going to say the brutal realities define us. I'm going to say, no, there's beauty and there's goodness and there's truth that define us. And so that, I guess, is a struggle trying to find the right balance, if anything.
Okay. Good. The topic of our colloquium is actually women and literature. So do you think that you, as a woman, as a female writer, have it harder in the literary world? Maybe, for example, to getting published, to get readers' respect or something like that?
I personally haven't experienced too much of it, thankfully. I do know some people who have, or at least feel that they have in different contexts. I would say there can be certain pressures. There is there is sort of, what do you say, like a trickle-down effect of the historical reality that for a long time women weren't taken seriously in not only the field of writing, but in almost every other kind of public field. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, you do get the fact that a lot of classic literature, vast majority of classic literature, is written by men. And so therefore there's a certain, I guess, measuring rod sometimes I feel like women are held up against because the classics are mostly written by men. And I mean, see, I kind of emphasize that I would say that I would give the same like writing advice to men and women equally, really. And I would say that women probably would do best, if at all possible, don't think too much about what are people going to say about me. Just do what you feel is expressing your authentic self. And I think what can happen too is that sometimes there's like a two-way seesaw that goes on with female writers or pressures that are put on female writers at times, because of course you have the old sort of pressures that was basically, in a sense, preventing women from being taken seriously. But then you have the other side, which now sometimes puts pressure on women to wave a banner of some kind in their writing that strongly asserts them as being feminist. In like that is the cause that they're going to really stake themselves out at. And if they're not doing that, then somehow they're failing women writers or failing women in the career world. I would say it really depends what someone is called to do, what they feel they need to do. I don't think women writers need to feel that they need to wave a banner, so to speak, in the sense of putting because sometimes, so here's something I have noticed in historical fiction, for example, especially, there is a tendency sometimes to put what amounts to Mary Sue characters who are hyper-feminist in a world and in a universe where this isn't even a thing at all. It's inserted. And I feel like sometimes that's because there's pressure put on women writers to make a statement, but it throws off their ability to tell a good story. So there should be a way in which to, I think maybe the best thing a woman writer can do for herself or for fellow female writers or fellow writers in general and the world in general is to be themselves. And I think that there are enough people who will be drawn to that naturally. Those who are, in a sense, open to it will be, and those who aren't, you can't do much about it. They're closed-minded.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think makes a successful writer in a general? Or what advice would you give to a writer?
Again, basically, being your authentic self. I think there is a lot to be said for getting some of the basic rubrics down, because I know some people who have really good ideas. I have friends who have really good ideas, but because they don't have core rubrics down about basically, I mean, I'm talking about even simple stuff like grammar, punctuation, basic formatting. It's very hard to, because again, they come to me, I'm an editor as well, so I edit. It's very hard for editors to make sense of it. And I think a lot of times their stuff gets scrapped because it's just difficult to follow. So I would say really learning the rubrics. On the other hand, and to balance that off, I would say that nowadays there, I think, is a bit of a problem in kind of writing classes where they try to enforce specific styles. And this isn't like rubric stuff. This isn't stuff like, yeah, there's universal rules of grammar and, it's universal rules of grammar, punctuation, basic formatting that you got to follow, and basic like, okay, beginning, middle, end concepts. But I do feel like sometimes there's a certain strangling effect of trying to make people conform to a given storytelling style. And honestly, I would say don't just blindly listen to a writing coach who wants you to conform to a given style. Maybe it's not your style. Maybe your style is, for example, old-fashioned, like, because that's what I've run into personally, where people will say your writing style, there's nothing, because I've run into that where people will say there's nothing technically wrong with your writing style. There's nothing mechanically wrong with it. But it's old-fashioned. It feels inspired by older novels or older poetry. And no doubt it is, because I do read a lot of classic material. But what I would say is, well, if there's nothing wrong with it, it simply is older fashioned, go for it. I mean, I almost feel like there can be different styles of writing. There can be completely different ways of telling a story. And if your voice comes out a little more classical, I mean, go for it. There's different types of music, because that's what I almost feel like too. Storytelling is a bit like music. I mean, there's people who will be into folk music and classical music, like I am, and there's people who will be into, pop or rock or whatever, rap. So there's just completely different styles. And I think the important thing to do is to find the style that best tells the story and best you feel it fits you like a glove, and go with that, and don't be driven off the rails by people saying, oh, that's old fashioned. I'm like, well, if it's old fashioned or if it's a little bit different, as long as you're sticking with basic normatives, you'll be okay. I think you should stick with your dream in a sense and your voice.
Yes. So who are some of your favorite writers, or maybe some of your favorite book heroines?
Okay. So I read a lot of mystical literature and poetry. So probably some of my favorite, I'm thinking of female ones in particular. Probably one of my real inspirations is actually St. Julian of Norwich. And she was the first woman to have a book published in English that was actually accredited to her as a woman. There was no changing of the names, or, it wasn't left anonymous. It was actually credited to her in a book format. And so I do take inspiration in her as a saint and as someone who wrote some of, in my opinion, the most profound and beautiful religious passages of the Middle Ages, in English too. So in my, native tongue. So that's, always been an inspiration to me. And another female author I quite appreciate is Carol Houselander. She was another British Catholic mystic. She wrote The Reed of God, and another book of hers that I quite like is The Way of the Cross. She wrote, again, a lot of these types, and she's actually feels like a similar voice to Julian, which is probably one of the reasons I quite like her, and I appreciate her style. And it's very poetic, and it's very emotional in its way of connecting to things, but it's also very simple, kind of understays, very British in that way. And so I really do appreciate them. As far as heroines, trying to think exactly. like in fandoms, I've always appreciated, you've got the sort of Arwen and Eowyn in fandoms. You have Princess Leia. I even liked Rey, in Star Wars. I know she's getting a lot of flack as a Mary Sue, but I liked her. I actually quite like Katniss Everdeen. I thought, in fact, they did a good job with her. I thought that they balanced the kind of the line, as I was saying, where I feel like sometimes they try to overdo the sort of the feminist angle too hard, where it feels like it's forced. I actually thought she came out feeling very natural as being a strong female character who has to literally fight to survive, without at the same time losing her femininity, which I think is an interesting thing. I guess it is. It's like a strong female character who still is definedly has her femininity, but is also literally fighting and killing, to survive, but also has a sort of a sensitivity to things, which I found quite attractive, really. And I would say you do get that in different portrayals of Maid Marian. It depends. Sometimes they're hit or miss, portrayals of Maid Marian. I like the version of her in actually the 1950s series, which I grew up with Richard Green and Bernadette O'Farrell playing Marian. And it was interesting because they said actually the way that she played it was kind of what they say, progressive for its age, because she was playing a role that did cross-dress and that did get into the action and was very active and could shoot and could do multiple things in a very active way with Robin and the Merry Men, and was very kind of astute, and was very with it, sort of, and so that was definitely something I found impactful growing up as well.
Mm-hmm. So what the role do women play in your novel?
Well, there are quite a few female characters. So you do have, as I mentioned in this volume, you have Marian, who is, the character who gets the sort of the focus of the three perspectives. And she is complex. And basically what I'm trying to do with the female characters is to create complex female characters. So I don't want them to fall into that two-way thing where it's like they're either submissive and they do nothing, or they're, I'm thinking of that movie, Snow White and the Huntsman as well, where I did feel like or even the Maid Marian that they did in the Russell Crowe Robin Hood, where they feel like the only way in which a woman can assert herself as being strong is if she's literally in armor. And I'm not saying that in the sense of, I actually do, as I mentioned, I like it when it's done well. So I liked it when it was managed with regards to Eowyn, when it was done Mulan, when it was done Katniss, when it was done Joan of Arc. When they manage to do it, it can be done. But when it isn't, it's just throwing, and it feels like it's forcing this notion of the only way a woman can be strong is literally if she's in armor. It's the only way. So I'm trying to kind of break that, where you do get characters where Marian, she is on the one hand a tomboy growing up, but on the other hand, she basically is vulnerable as well. So on the one hand, she's strong, she's spunky, but she's also very vulnerable. And when she goes through tragedies in her life, she actually deals with mental illness. And I think that's important because there's a lot of stigma about that. And there's a lot of stigma about, and this is, again, one of the hard topics that comes up in this, but basically having suicidal tendencies. And so I basically have a Marian, and I know some people, I'm not sure exactly how this is going to come off, but it does. I have a Marian who goes through a phase of having suicidal tendencies and self-harm tendencies because she loses her mom, and a bunch of other social pressures that happen to her. And basically it just hits her all at a very vulnerable age when she's 13, and she goes through all of this. But and I think actually for the fact of her going through this makes her a stronger character. And she comes out of it always knowing what it is to have scars, and she comes out of it having compassion now, like a new compassion for other people. And how she basically develops, she does develop into a noblewoman who can be very elegant on the one hand, but also very strong. And she winds up basically breaking with convention by basically ultimately inheriting her own lands, which is something that has never happened in the Shire in my version before. And it's something that probably wouldn't have been allowed legally if not for the fact that her friendship with Roger, who's the future sheriff. At this point, he is, by the time she does inherit, he is the sheriff. And it's only by him basically pulling strings and bending the law that she's able to do it. But she basically shocks them all by running things very well. So she's both strong and vulnerable. And I think the same is true of a lot of the female characters I have, because you also have like Robin's mother, Eldrida, she's very strong, very outspoken, but on the other hand, she's broken from a lot of bad things that have basically happened to her because her father was in a rebellion. And then we deal with another dark topic, which is that she was a rape victim when, the soldiers basically crushed her father's rebellion. And she moves on from it. But still, she's wounded from it all. And there's nothing that's going to completely make that go away, even though she has moved on and she now has a husband and a child, and she's, it still is always going to affect her that this happened. So, yeah, I suppose maybe the themes is in the case of a lot of the women in the story, that they're shown as dealing with things that are really quite weighty, but at the same time, their strength comes in kind of taking that and going through the process of any, whatever they're going through, but still coming out as being authentically themselves in a sense. And the last one I'll do for I won't go on too long on it, but is in a later book, because she does become like one of the main characters, is the sheriff's daughter. And she's actually the first character I created for the series. That was the very genesis of what I wanted to do. And I said, why don't we, we've seen a lot of stories like Thinking Princess of Thieves, which was about Robin Hood's daughter. And I'm like, well, the sheriff has a daughter, and let's roll with that. So I created Celia, and she's a very different kind of strong figure, because she seems very demure. She's very shy. She's demure. She's like her mother was as well, kind of very, very shy, demure, seems like a shrinking violet, but she has a strong moral sense. She's basically based off of a number of saints that, I kind of pulled from. So a little bit like, I did pull from Julian, from Hildegard of Bingen, from Therese of Lisieux, Elizabeth of the Trinity. I kind of put a lot of them into her. And so on the one hand, she comes off as being, again, very introverted and kind of laid back and shy and scared of everything. But on the other hand, when push comes to shove, she's got almost a sense of reading people, reading souls, and being very morally strong. And in that sense, she's the person who brings out the best in almost everybody around her who has any level of soul left. She can bring that out even by being, again, this sort of, shy, reticent girl. She still is, in a sense, her strength is her purity of spirit. So she still, again, has that dynamic of being a strong female character, even if she's not leading armies or overtly, in your face about it. She still is.
So that's an interesting take on the story, to provide a dive into the character's psychology and the struggles resulting from it, especially in the context that it's based on a historical legend, and it's a kind of a historical novel. because I believe, or I think that the general public has this idea that in the past people didn't focus so much on the psychology, on what was going on inside, because there were more important struggles in the way of materialistic world. So somehow they focus more on surviving rather than tackling these issues.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is obviously true in the sense of some things, but other things I think have never changed. So in a sense, you do have, number one, different social strata. So obviously Marian and Aldrida, in some ways, they're privileged. They come from the upper classes. But I think even peasants, I'm sure, suffered from psychological situations. They may not have had all the words, because that's kind of what I'm thinking. Even when I'm writing, like, for example, things, for example, like Marian's mom dies of a brain tumor. They wouldn't have the words for that. I know it as a writer. That's what she dies from. But they wouldn't be able to articulate that. They would just say she's been getting sick and she's been getting dizzy and she's been nauseous and they don't know what's going on. She has fainting spells. So it's the same thing with this kind of thing. They wouldn't have a word like depression. They wouldn't have self-harm, wouldn't be a concept. They wouldn't know what was going on. I do kind of show that they don't really know, like the people around Marian, for example, they don't really know how to counsel her or give her therapy. All they know is, oh my gosh, she tried to kill herself, and oh my gosh, why is she doing that? Like, why is she cutting her? Why? And they don't really understand, but they kind of tie it in that, okay, something seems to have gone wrong around the time of her mother's death. Something has been triggered, but they don't have the verbiage. And that's kind of what I'm doing with a lot of things, where I feel like actually things haven't changed that much. I'm honestly convinced basically just the human story has not changed that much. I think people have mostly been dealing with much of the same. Obviously things differ a little from point to point, but I think what changes more is language more than what happens. So again, it's like people still deal with disease, people still deal with mental health, people still deal with emotional health, people still deal with trauma. And again, PTSD is another one that I deal with later on with some of the characters come back from the Crusades. And they wouldn't have the words. It's like, what do you call it? But it is, it's like by any other name, that's what it is. They're still suffering from it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant, that people as individuals, they don't change that much and they were pretty much the same in the past. But what changes, in my opinion, is the attitude of the society, which is also related to the language issue that you mentioned. That in the past, those topics like talking about your mental health problems would be possibly taboo in the society.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. That's true. And there would be a lot of just a lot of taboos that would be in place about all kinds of things. So and I touch upon that slightly in one of the chapters where we're talking about basically the complete lack of sex ed in some cases of the upper aristocracy. There was way more sexual understanding among like the peasants, because they would be, it would be way more just open, especially because also you have, like, you're dealing with, it was an agrarian society. You're dealing with animals. You're dealing with, there's more of an awareness of sex and so on and so forth because of just nature. But if you come from the upper end, there's sort of the notion, especially among women, I was reading about this, where basically they would kind of tell a girl, I even remember reading about this. This lasted well into the Renaissance and beyond. I mean, it lasted for a very, very long time. But the notion is that women were more sexually rapacious somehow than men, and they were the ones who would go out of their way to lead men astray, and they were the ones who really just wanted sex. They couldn't control themselves, and that is why there was like a fear of female sexuality, basically. And so there was this logic that don't feed women spicy foods. Don't do anything. Don't talk to them about sex at all. Just don't talk to them, because it'll trigger something and they'll turn into these sluts. Don't do this. And so they would just, and so what would happen, of course, would be, you're put into a marriage and you're basically informed next to nothing. So your first encounter with sex is going to be pretty dicey because it's just like, yeah, okay, you don't know what's going on. I mean, maybe bare minimum. And I kind of, again, I touch on that in a scene where you basically deal with the fact, not only for women, also men barely knew anything either. Oftentimes in the upper class, they would give like a basic, like, you have to complete your duty on the night of, your marriage night. You must consummate this or you're not a man. You are, you have failed, you are miserable, you are dirt. So go on, do this. And then the pressure to have an heir instantly, have an heir now. And it's just like, okay, this is gonna mess with them psychologically, especially when a lot of them are like teenagers. It's like, it's not ready for this much pressure all at one time. And yeah, so there was a lot of weird hangups in the day.
Yeah, that have been really like terrible. Also, and as for their mental health, like the push on doing these things, and they have all this responsibility. Basically, love didn't matter in the higher society. What matters was to establish some kind of economical union. So marriages were usually agreed on without the two people's consent, or it was agreed on by the parents.
It's interesting too, because part of what's actually helped me write this stuff, because a big part of Roger's story in book 1 is his marriage, and it does deal with the whole notion of arranged marriage in that feudal era society. And it's interesting because I have a number of friends who come from countries where arranged marriages are still very much a thing. They haven't, they're ranging from Pakistan to Iran to Lebanon, and there's still those traditions come with them to the West if they immigrate, and there still is a sense of basically marriage arrangement. So it ranges a great deal in how it's done. It can either be complete, like, again, back in time I'm speaking now, but like it can range in the sense of both parties really don't know much of what's going on, period, to where, all right, there is some degree of some type of an understanding that's come to, and there should be, like, even there is a kind of a notion that both parties should ideally at least be consenting on some level, like a duty consent, even of that, to this whole thing. But it definitely, I mean, even if you were dutifully consenting, it would be a heck of a lot awkward to, especially because you had situations, and I kind of portray this in the story, that you're meeting the person literally, and I mean, I know people who've had this happen as well. The day before the marriage, for the first time, you're allowed to have like a conversation. Hello, how are you? Good. And then the next day it's, okay, we have to consummate this thing right now. And it's so, yeah, it could be dicey, really dicey.
Really crazy notion. Okay, so maybe we can turn now from the fiction to your non-fiction writing. So where do you take inspiration for your non-fiction writing, or what topics do you tackle on?
Well, as you said in the beginning, a lot of what I do is sort of religiously focused. So I will do a lot of religious reflections and just kind of meditations oftentimes. Sometimes it will be kind of like freelance poetry. Sometimes it will be on theology. I'll get a little headier. Sometimes it will be on interfaith sort of comparisons. So I do a lot of writing regarding Christian and Muslim beliefs and contrasts. Also Christian and pagan beliefs oftentimes, because I do have a lot of interest in Celtic things. So I will focus a lot sometimes on sort of Celtic Christianity and Celtic paganism, and how those two things kind of meshed on the one hand and then diverge on another. So a lot of that is just a result of my religious upbringing and my religious interest in how I think basically different cultures also overlap with religion, and how they all reveal, I think, a common yearning of human beings to seek out basically encounter with the divine, to seek out encounter with something beyond just the physical and material universe, and to seek out the transcendentals, in a sense, of goodness, truth, and beauty. So a lot of it is that. Some of my other writings are on media review. So there's a lot on like movie reviews, music and books and things of that nature. I do enjoy reviewing movies a lot because they help me with my writing, because they give me stories. It's like they give me almost a template for what I want to do, what I don't want to do. And so in that sense, I almost enjoy watching fiction stories told to me more in movie form than I do reading them. And by contrast, I like reading nonfiction more than watching documentaries. Mm-hmm. So for whatever reason, I enjoy the visual of a story, and therefore I'll have like a bunch of different thoughts when I come out of a movie. I'm just like, all right, I want to, write everything down. I want to analyze this thing and then use it for data later on and whatnot. And I'll also do, like, I did a comparison, things like that. Like I did a rather long article. This was even before Game of Thrones wrapped up, but I did a comparison between Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. And, mm-hmm. That was back, I think, when it was just at season 6. So there was 2 more seasons left to go. I should probably maybe go back and update it and re-release it or something like that. But yeah, so I do a lot of stuff like that. So mostly spirituality and media, really, on the broad sweep of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. And that's also what your magazine is focused on.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. So what is it like to be a chief editor? Like, what responsibilities you have, or how does it function? How does it work?
I mean, it's been an interesting ride. So my job has basically changed constantly. Like, as far as what I'll be doing in a given year, it has changed. I mean, over the years of my being the editor-in-chief, it's just changed a great deal, depending like what my staff, is doing, basically. And if I have a staff, because at the moment we are entirely volunteer. So we're really hoping, in fact, that perhaps next year we'll be able to get a nonprofit status, or at least track down some grants to be able to help with the running of everything. And with the funding of the next conference, which we were hoping to have in 2021, but now that's no longer the case due to COVID, and just every schedule has been out of sorts. So it will probably be in 2022. But currently, with the editor-in-chief, I have a really good staff, and they, do take care of, at this point, most of the editing and posting end of things. So you have a system where submissions will come in to my editor email. They'll go to the chief editor, then he'll file them out to the other sub-editors. They'll get them done, and then they'll send it back to the managing editor, who will then file them into the file system and then keep a chart of basically everything that comes in. And we usually schedule well in advance, just so that we make sure we have fuel to run, because that's literally what keeps us going, in a sense, is the fuel. So we usually do schedule pieces months in advance. And then we'll keep the tallied list of where everything goes, and have everything has now been very neatly sorted out. I can't thank more than enough Beth Amos and her brother Mike Amos, who have been helping me on staff now for almost a year of doing all this, and they improved the system massively. They made it way more linear. And it's the same thing with basically the posters. Therefore, we'll take the pieces, we'll put them out, we'll schedule them. And that's generally how we do it. And then we run the themed issues if we can usually get enough pieces in a given theme. We try to run themed issues now about 3 times a year with different themes, and we'll run them on issue format. So it's ISSUU format, and that's been what we've been doing as well. So we kind of have the blog, which is the regular output of material, and then we have the special edition kind of things, which you can flip like a little book. So that's basically been the way it runs. I personally, at the moment, basically part of what I've been doing now is going through the entirety of the files, fixing tags and fixing pictures, because basically what happened is we did a massive overhaul on the site this year, in which we got volunteers again to change the entire basically front and the whole organization of it, and the organization of the archives. And we moved a ton of old content that was, because we've moved, we've moved about 3 sites by now, or 4 sites even, to the one we're currently at. So we had a lot of loose material hanging around, and we still have a folder left over, but most of everything has been moved. And so as a result, we basically realized, heck, we've got a ton of stuff which hasn't been labeled properly. We've got a ton of stuff that doesn't have credits to the images. We need to go back and fix everything. So that's basically what I have been trying to do: fix all of the pictures, make sure that they're quality visually, and make sure that they are credited, and stuff like that. So basically we're either using free images off of sites like Pixabay and Unsplash and things like that, or images that are like kind of within fair use. So like images of like Lord of the Rings, or images from Wikipedia, for example. And trying to just get them all labeled and say, this is this, this is this, this is this, and make it look good and make it look organized. And so that's basically what I've been trying to do, and hoping that when that is all done, it will look better when we try to present it really for grants and try to present it for funding, because that is what we're trying to head toward, trying to monetize to some extent, which will enable us, again, to expand and do better and bigger things with it.
Yeah. So that sounds quite a lot of hard work behind it.
It is. It's a bit tedious because it's very individualized, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's like hundreds of these things.
Yeah. And what about your contributors? Where are they from? Or do you have more female or male contributors?
I would definitely say we have more female, because from the onset, this was founded by 3 female writers. So I think we sort of drew, into our circle, our sort of female extended interests. And I suppose it kind of varies a little bit. Like, there's some jokes that go around, obviously, that like Ink and Fairy Dust was more the girl magazine, and that Fellowship of the King sounded more masculine, and it's kind of a mesh. But I mean, honestly, both, I think we're trying to strike a balance where it feels like both can be equally represented. It doesn't feel too dominant one way or another. But it feels like basically there's a little something there for everybody, who would be interested and who feels represented and whatnot. And it's kind of interesting because just now, my new managing editor actually is male, and he, Wesley Hutchins, if he's around, he basically has been one of the oldest staff members as well. So it made sense. But it's nice because he's the first male second in command. So now I think it feels a bit more balanced in a sense of being more female male instead of female dominant, which I think is good because, again, I want to broaden the audience. But as far as location of contributors, pretty much all over the place. Main bulk would be the US, Canada, the UK. But we have people basically from all over the place. Obviously, you have submitted. And so we've had people from Eastern Europe. We've had people from the Middle East. We've had people, Pakistan, India, Australia. So, I mean, we basically do cast a pretty wide net. Anyone who's interested in, again, doing kind of a spiritual take on media and fandom and storytelling. That is basically our goal. So we're trying to kind of pull people. We obviously have a mainly Christian group, but we do have a mix as well. We have a diversity within the staff. And we have diversity within the community that, writes for us and follows us on Facebook and whatnot. So we have a variety of people, whether they're, Christian, Muslim, pagan, Jewish, and some atheist, agnostic, it's pretty much open to anyone who wants to kind of delve in and be a part of it.
Yeah, so you're all inclusive.
Yeah, exactly. Basically all inclusive, so long as they follow our basic kind of mission statement and tone. They get our tone down, our basic rules. Yes.
This made me wondering, when you have contributors from all over the world, do you also have reach all over the world? Or what's your usual reach? Do you have any statistics or how many people follow your magazine?
We should actually, you know what? I feel like I should look right now because like I know that we, like, as far as like our likes on Facebook and stuff, you know, which is like 1,200 something at this point. But I feel like I should probably look at stats. Like on our, we've ranged a lot in stats. Like some days it will be like 50 hits. Some days it will be 100 hits. You know, like on a super good day, we've gotten like 800 hits. So it's active. I mean, I think we can do better. I'm hoping we can expand our reach, but we do have a lot of hits, and it does seem like we do have a lot of hit range, again, in the places where the main bulk of contributors come. So obviously US, UK, Canada, English-speaking countries, mainly, because it's an English language magazine. But then you do obviously get different hits, you know, elsewhere. Obviously, you get them in different places in Europe. You get them in, you know, Australia. You get them in Middle East. So it is pretty much a universal outreach.
So it's pretty good for a volunteer magazine, like when
It is.
voluntarily. Okay. And another great contribution of yours was the conference that you organized last year. It was called The More Than Memory and dedicated to appreciating Tolkien's spiritual legacy. So what inspired you to organize it?
Well, what wound up happening actually happened quite by accident, because the original organizer contacted the old Fellowship of the King page. This was after the merger. And basically said, hey, you know, I see you're a Tolkien-themed magazine. Would you like to set up a table at this Tolkien conference that's going to be held? And I said, sure. Why not? And then, of course, we were talking about, hey, would you like to come to this thing or not? And I'm like, well, you know, I don't know if I'm going to be able to come. You know, it's expensive. But as things started rolling, basically, I got somewhat involved in the pseudo planning. And then it turns out the organizer had to drop out. And I said, okay, that's kind of sad, because there's all these people at this point who were invested in doing this. So basically I said, look, I'll pick it up, you know, and I'll try to make something of it and put it under the auspices of Fellowship and Fairy Dust. So that's basically what happened. We put the whole thing under the auspices and launched it as a literary conference that was basically celebrating the legacy and the life of Tolkien, and his spiritual, mainly, impact. So there was a lot of talks pertaining to Tolkien's Catholicism, but also we had some pertaining to other religions and what they thought of Tolkien. And we also just had some tables that were didn't have to do with Tolkien, but they had to do with something else that FNF sort of does, like interreligious dialogue and whatnot. So it was a blend, but majority was Tolkien related material. And it was quite amazing. You know, it was something that I always kind of wanted to do. Obviously, going to England, I've been a massive Britophile my whole life, so it was just a great experience, you know, and it was very enjoyable to be able to get so many people together for a common event like that.
Yeah. Did you have like any renowned Tolkien academics or somehow someone?
Yeah, we had see, I probably would need a list in front of myself. But we had one that's coming to mind immediately is Dr. Alison Milbank. And she's not just on Tolkien, but she's a literary commentator. We had Father Michael Halsell, who wrote a book about Tolkien and theology. We had I'm thinking names. I'm thinking of a name, if I can actually remember it. Stuart McCulloch, who runs the G.K. Chesterton, basically Cause for Canonization, in the UK. And he basically did a talk on comparing Chesterton and Tolkien. And thinking of others, we had Charles Colomb, who is also an author historian. He goes around in various circles. So we did have an interesting, we definitely had an interesting blend of people. Sarah de Nordwell, she's a poet and theater person in the UK. And Victoria Steed, she also does basically she does talks and such for the Bishops' Council in the UK. So yeah, it was very interesting. It was a very interesting thing of bringing other people together. There was various others, and my brain is just slipping on who exactly they were. There was probably about, I'm going to give like, I think 20 speakers. So it was over the course of about 2 days. So it was a pretty full event in that sense. It had a lot of different angles and facets to it.
So it was a pretty huge event.
Yeah, it was. It was definitely it was pretty nice. I mean, looking back on it, there's definitely things I wanted to plan better, and if I do it again, I want to plan it better, like just more set up. But for a maiden voyage, I think honestly it went as well as it could have gone.
Yeah. And since you are in the US and the conference was taking place in Oxford, I believe that planning was quite harder.
It was. It was definitely, and at least that was one of the things I kind of knew was going to be the case. But it was pretty difficult because it was like, all right, you have to try to find there's the time difference, trying to communicate with people, trying to communicate with Lady Margaret Hall, which is where we had the event. First, we weren't even sure we were going to have it at Lady Margaret Hall because we were basically shopping around for a location for it, and it was, kind of long and drawn out. We would have to do, checkpoints and try to, with volunteers often who were in the UK, and I was here and trying to catch everybody. And then when I was there, again, it was just a matter that I had an international phone I thought was supposed to work on me. It didn't. And then I couldn't call anybody. And so I was constantly trying to message them on Facebook was my best bet. So that was another element of it. And it just was harder being further away. Though I think now that I've done it, I think I'll have an easier time next time, just because I'm aware of some of the kinks that I ran into. So I have hope that the second round will be a little more set up and stabilized.
Yeah. In that context, and maybe prepared you a little bit better for this situation of the quarantine times.
Oh, yeah, exactly. No, I mean, really, it's almost like I almost can't believe, because if it had been 1 year different, like this, it would have never happened. So in that sense, it was just like, wow, okay, but yeah, no, hopefully all this, yeah, quarantine times will kind of, I think, prepare me a little better for trying to do it again. And
from distance.
Yes, exactly. Long distance. It definitely did prepare me in that sense.
Yeah. Okay. And I know that you are planning another conference, which was supposed to be next year, but due to the COVID and the situation, it will be moved. So what will it be about?
So the next conference which probably, hopefully, will be in 2022, probably spring, will be called Passage of Light. And basically what it is sort of an East meets West theme. So trying to do religious topics and stories from basically Eastern and Western religious traditions. Majority will probably be Christian and Muslim, but there probably will be a sprinkling of some other as well. So we might have some Jewish voices, some pagan voices and mixed in, and you get, again, a kind of an overarching sense of sort of Eastern and Western literary traditions with, I guess, a spiritual flavor to them. So there will probably be a lot of talk about religious writers. So probably like classical religious writers, like you do get like Julian of Norwich or John of the Cross. And then on their side, like, Rumi and Ibn Arabi and things like that. So kind of trying to find some common ground in the great sort of religious literary poets and writers.
Yeah. So that sounds interesting, and I wish that it doesn't get postponed any longer, and that
Yes, me too.
that everything works out well in the end for you. And also, good luck with your book and getting it published. And since I don't have any more questions for you, now it's time for our viewers, our listeners, to ask any questions. So if anybody has any question, you can either ask them directly or write them into the chat field. Well, waiting for the questions, one more came into my mind. When you organized the conference last year, did you get any funding for it? Or was it
Very minimal.
Project?
Very minimal. And this is sort of one of the reasons, one of the other things that I really am hoping to have better figured out the next time. And part of the proceeds of my book sales hopefully are going to go toward that. So I'm hoping that if I can sell, some books, because I already have currently in the sort of wider treasury of FNF from the last conference, we have left over about $800. So we're trying to build that, obviously, to where we have enough to have a little bit of breathing room to plan ahead. So that we're able to figure out location, refreshments, just general lodging for the staff, which was an issue, and just generally sorting things out. So that will definitely be helpful. I'm also hoping that a friend of mine who actually was like my second in command in the UK on the ground, Ian Inkster, intends to read my book, do like a read audio version. And so the hope there is that we'll also be able to sell it in audio form. So we'll be able to hopefully pick up a little bit of money and put that toward having just a little bit of a cushion for the next time around.
Good. Okay, so any questions from our listeners, from our students? Oh, here's one. Maria writes, I really enjoyed your conversation. It was very nice and inspiring. I wanted to ask about your literary inspirations, but you already answered that. Yeah. So I tried to think about all the possible aspects or all the possible topics and to include in my questions. So I prepared.
You did a very good job, by the way. Very good interviewing job.
And Maria adds, so what music? What about music?
Oh, music. So as I mentioned, I really enjoy folk and classical music and religious music, basically old time sounding music, which I do use to help me write. So some of my favorite music artists are like Lorena McKennett, and Carlene is another one I listen to a lot. She does a lot of fandom music, and Medieval Babes I've been listening to a lot. Julie Fowlis, Maddie Pryor, Julie Murphy I've been listening to a lot. She does Welsh music. So basically I do a lot of British Isles folk type stuff. Karen Casey is Irish folk singer. I also enjoy like Middle Eastern style music. So I listen to Sami Yusuf quite a lot, and Amina Sultana. So some, people who do Islamic style music, I quite enjoy that, Sufi music. And also just in general, religious music and hymns I quite like. So stuff like from choirs, King's College Choir, and Anonymous 4 is another group that I enjoy listening to. And just any type of music like that. I also do music myself. So I'm actually, when I'm not doing writing, I do singing, and I play penny whistle and borin drum and auto harp. So that's another like thing I do, which is sort of me folk music binging. So, and I have put some of my poems to music as well. So that's been fun.
Mhm. Based on all you've said, I think that you have been born into a wrong country. You are in the US, but all your life is centered around things British.
Yeah, I've always had a real interest in British things. It's just something about the whole um, ethos of the history and the heritage just really appealed to me. And I admit, I felt kind of like a fish going back into water when I was in England. So, so there's something to it, probably. I just don't know what it is yet.
Similar feeling. When I came into Oxford, it was like a dream come true, and it's
Yes.
a wonderful place.
Well, I was going to say, if we do, I mean, the next time round, if you could make it out, you'd be more than welcome to come and speak, because we're also going to be probably incorporating Tolkien from the Western side, like Tolkien's religious and spiritual and mystical elements and such. So if you ever, can manage to come out, we'd really welcome having you.
Yeah, I'm counting on it too, and I'll be much honored to be presenting at your conference.
Yeah, we'd love to have you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question. What do you do when you have a writer's block? Any good advice?
Well, it depends what I've got the writer's block on. So if I'm writing, so sometimes I have had terrible writer's blocks on a given story, and it just hasn't turned out too well. That's why I have unfinished projects. But typically, if there's sort of a writer's block with a story, like a novel situation, what I'll do is I'll switch chapters. I'll write a different chapter. I'll just get out of that chapter that I'm having the stuck point. Because sometimes I will, I feel like I've hit a brick wall when it comes to dialogue a lot. I'm just like, okay, I feel like they should get out of this conversation, but I don't know how to have them end the conversation without it just falling flat. So I'll sort of have to step away and try to work on something different, or talk sometimes for me. So if I'll do internet chatting with people, and sometimes that, weirdly enough, will gear me back into writing dialogue. It's like, okay, now I remember what real humans sound like. I can go and try to reproduce that. So that's definitely something I've done. Sometimes you need to just step away from the computer completely. Just go, just watch a movie, just do something else, just step away, and just try to not force yourself too hard, because sometimes when you're forcing yourself, it's just not working. And I mean, there are times when you have to force yourself. I mean, I've had enough deadline situations where you don't have much of a choice. You've got to force it. But if you don't have a strict deadline, then you're probably not going to do your best work if you're forcing yourself. So, do whatever is relaxing to you, whether that's prayer and meditation, or watching TV, or talking to friends, or listening to music. Just let your mind unwind and maybe come back to it with fresh eyes. Maybe actually go and ask your friends, I think, for help with the piece. Sometimes that helps as well, because I've said many times, you can only read your piece so many times. This happened to me a lot, where it's just like, okay, if I read this thing one more time, I'm going to change it entirely, because you start getting ultra scrupulous. And sometimes I've had a friend say, actually, there's nothing wrong with this. Why do you keep changing it? It's almost like an impulse, a little bit of scrupulosity in writing, where it's like, oh no, it's not 100% perfect. And it's like, it's never going to be 100% perfect. Kind of, it kind of reminds me of a tradition they say with an Islamic tradition, where the interior designers of the geometric design within mosques, they would always intentionally make a mistake, partially so that the sultans who hired them wouldn't get furiously mad. I paid you and you ruined it. So they all would make at least one mistake. And then they would say, as their sort of rebuff, well, only Allah is perfect. You can't blame me. There's going to be a mistake somewhere. So I kind of put that in my head too. It's like, you know what? This is never going to be 100% perfect. You got to live with it. You want it to be as good as possible, but sometimes you can run your wheels in a really bad way and just get yourself thrown off, where you're actually not doing your best because you're so fixated upon being perfect.
Yeah. Okay, do we have any more questions?
Hello. So I've got one question just due to my curiosity. You've mentioned that you usually write books in a way like you start the ending and then write just several parts of it and then start right from the very start of the book and then connect all the parts. So is this way like, I mean, easier for you to write all of the books? Do you use this type of writing most of the time, or sometimes you can just write from the very start and then step by step to the end?
So it kind of depends on how long the piece is. If it's a short story, sometimes I can write it from the start to the finish without sort of doing the inverted form. But if it's a long story, typically I do write out of order because for me, it actually helps connect the dots better because what winds up happening is I go in kind of a spiral formation. So I'll write out of order. I'll write the beginning and the end, and then I'll connect the dots. But ultimately, I will go and I'll kind of re-look at the beginning and the end again and again, and making sure all the pieces are kind of sitting properly in the muffin pan, as it were, and trying to make sure they connect. I mean, that is all the more so in a series. I feel like I'm doing it more now than ever because when you're writing something that spans now 8 books, it's like you really want to make sure that all of the bits, you don't have like one book feels one way and the next book feels completely different. Like you kind of want there to be some sense of continuity between the volumes. So I do find that in that sense, writing out of order actually helps a lot because you're kind of keeping the tone similar because you've written bits from all different parts at roughly the same time. So you can kind of work around that to try to give them a sense of continuity.
Yeah, I believe that it's the case with most of writers because, or that it's very rarely that a huge book or a longer story gets written from start to the end, like
Yeah.
without any interruption. Okay, Teresia is writing. Uh, is it simple to join your writing and personal life? You must spend so much time by writing.
Well, it kind of depends. Again, because I'm a freelancing night owl, it kind of, it does sort of make a dent in a sense into your personal life. But I almost feel like it's kind of like birthing a baby or something, or taking care of a baby, maybe more accurately. That, people say when they're new parents, it's like, yeah, we have to be up all night taking care of the baby. It's almost a little similar when you're trying, in the case of a novel, to do it. It can be a bit denting. Like I know some people, even just with regards to people who are like, hey, did you like die? I haven't heard from you in forever, and I'm like, yeah, I'm still alive. And like, do you hate us? No, I don't hate you. But, it does become a bit kind of involved. And sometimes, yeah, it can be tricky. It can be something where you do have to kind of remember priorities of like your, the most important thing ultimately at the end of the day is actually not your writing, in spite of how, at the moment you sometimes feel. So you have to kind of take a step back and think about your obligations to other people and your obligations to, well, life itself, and trying to make it all mesh. And I think that at this point, again, when you're at the beginning of the writing process, it doesn't feel as heavy. Interestingly enough, when you actually get toward the end, it feels more all encompassing because I think what happens, you start to focus on, I'm this close, I'm almost going to make it to the end. You just want to get it done. So you just want to like, okay, focus, completely focus, inundate yourself, get to the end, and then sort of be, I'm free, freedom kind of thing.
I'm always amazed that with all of the writing that you do, with all of the work around your web page, and that you still manage to be very active on social media, on Facebook. You post a lot of things throughout the day.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it's sort of funny because I almost find that that's a bit of therapy,
Mhm.
because it's like I mean, most of the stuff I post tends to be kind of, well, uplifting. I try to post some uplifting or funny or kind of cute or things that kind of just take my mind off of it for a little while. And it does, I think it helps me, the fact that I am engaging. The thing with social media is that you're engaging with other real people. And I think it's kind of interesting because I think some people get the impression that social media is not real people. It's like, well, no, it is real people. They're real people. They're just using a medium to connect. But they're real. And that's distinct from, I think, there is a pitfall that can happen if you are just focusing upon fictional characters, whether that is in reading or in writing, where all that you're doing, like practically 24/7, is thinking about fictitious characters and doing their voices. There is the slight risk of turning a little schizophrenic with that, of doing the, the different voices and the characters and focusing on it so much. So you gotta kind of sometimes take a step out and be like, hey, make this a social endeavor, engage with real people, bring people on board, which actually has helped me a lot. Because I do have some wonderful friends who help me, editing and help me going through things. And it makes it feel less oppressive and lonely of doing sort of the writing, because it's like, okay, I've got real people here who are going to help me get through this and help this thing come to fruition. It's not like it's just me and these voices in my head, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And that brings another two questions to my mind. You apparently read a lot for your research, for preparing for your novel. So how much do you read, like Balestri and such?
Well, it really just depends. I probably should be reading more, because I used to read more in the form of books.
Mm-hmm.
Now most of what it is, well, see, I almost feel like a lot of this is stuff that was in my head for a very long time, because I used to read tons of nonfiction history books. And I would go on interlibrary loan searches to find these obscure eyewitness accounts from like history and different analysis of history, and just really delved into sort of the nonfiction dry history texts, and was just picking for things that were interesting to me, and then sort of downloaded them. And that's almost why I feel like this series is kind of a fruition thing, because I feel like all that research kind of came out again in this. But now I think the ratio of writing is higher than reading, just because of kind of where it is. Whereas most of my reading now is more like online reading. So it's like you look something up, like if you have a, whatever it may be, if you're looking up the poetry of Taliesin and trying to figure out, okay, would people be quoting this in whatever, the 12th century, look it up, or trying to just, because that's a little bit of what I do too, is I add sort of little tidbits into the story without trying to make it feel organic, but also trying to leave like little interesting bits of information. Like, oh, did you know that the Saxons and the Welsh actually tried to team up at some point to kick out the Normans, and that would be remembered? Or, oh, did you know there was a warrior Welsh princess who got beheaded, by the Normans, and oh, did you know, like these little things about, and of course some of it is estimating and guesstimating, and I realize that because the Middle Ages is different than my main area of research, which was the long 18th century. And the reason is the long 18th century, it's early modern. So there's more verifiable stuff you can pin down when it comes to that. Whereas in the Middle Ages, there's some verifiable stuff, and then there's a lot of stuff that even like high-level professors of medieval studies, they argue about it. They don't really know. There's not indelible proof of certain things. And this is even more so when it comes to doing a legend retelling like this, because you've got a legend that spans, again, centuries worth of time and history and folk memory. And so you've got a sort of a zigzag reality where some things, even though I've settled upon the sort of the traditional time period of the Third Crusade, you still realize that the ballads and the old legendarium material, it stretches in such a way that there's some stuff that's going to be archaic to the time period, like stuff that actually sounds more like it should be like 100 or so years earlier, or stuff that feels ahead of its time, like 100 or so years forward. And there's not much you can do about it if you want to try to stay at least loosely in gear with the legends. You just don't want anything to puncture too hard, so to speak. You want it to seem reasonably, or at least plausibly connected, which actually brings to mind something that I do take a lot of inspiration from, and it is The Ballad of the White Horse by G.K. Chesterton, and his notion of telescoping history through myth and legend. Because there is that sense I get from The Ballad of the White Horse, where it's pulling all different things almost from the past and the future into this sort of point, this point on the scale, which is Alfric and his battle with the Danes, which of course is it's archetypal, it's representative of a whole bunch of other things. And that's kind of what I'm doing with Robin and his, you might say, conflict with the Sheriff of Nottingham. It's meant to be an archetype of wider things that telescopes history, as opposed to being a literal, you might say, historical account of anything. It's something that's a bit more universal than that.
Mm-hmm. And with all of this work that you have, and considering that you are rather a night person, how much do you sleep a day?
Oh gosh, it kind of depends. It wildly depends what I have to do that day, but if I have my choice, what I'll do is I'll work through the night on whatever, and then I'll sleep most of the day and get up at night and sleep, kind of invert. But there's been times when I have had to go on low sleep, and that can be unpleasant, to say the least. I don't do that great on super low sleep, but yeah, it was funny because in the UK I actually slept quite well. I think it was just the exhaustion of everything. I just went to sleep very well and would wake up and be like, I'm ready to do this now. So that was nice.
Yeah. No, I lost my train of thought. Okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask that. It actually surprised me that you decided for this time, because in the US you are deep in the night yet, still.
Yeah. No, we're currently at like 5:40 in the morning.
Yeah. So
it's my nocturnal streak.
Yeah. Okay. So do we have any more questions? Okay, possibly nothing more from the students. So it was quite a long session. I didn't expect it to last this long, but I'm happy about it. And thank you very much for your time that you joined us and agreed to do this interview. And
absolutely. Thank you so much as well. You've done a great job interviewing, and I've enjoyed interacting with the students.
Yeah, it was a good time. Okay, so thank you very much, and good luck in your work, and maybe see you some other time.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, by all means. Okay, so let me just finish out a log out here. Do you know how to log out? Do you know how to log out of this?
Yes, I just ended and it ends for everyone.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, great. Okay, thanks so much, Martina. You have a great morning, I guess.
And good night for you. Good sleep.
Yes, thank you. Okay, bye. God bless.
Bye.